Many people believe their negative thoughts define who they are. They assume that if they often feel anxious, doubtful, self-critical, or pessimistic, it must be part of their personality. But from a neuroscience perspective, negative thinking is not a fixed trait. It is a learned pattern created by repeated activity in the brain. Every thought you have activates a network of neurons. When the same thought appears again and again over days, months, or years, those neurons strengthen their connections. This process follows a basic principle of the nervous system. Neurons that fire together wire together. The brain becomes more efficient at producing the same thought because it has practiced that pathway many times. Early experiences play a large role in building these patterns. The brain is especially plastic during childhood and adolescence, meaning it learns quickly from repeated emotional experiences. If someone grows up in an environment filled with criticism, pressure, fear, or uncertainty, the brain may learn to anticipate negative outcomes. Thoughts like, "I'm not good enough," "something will go wrong," or "people will judge me" can become automatic responses. Over time, the brain treats these thoughts as default predictions rather than possibilities. The brain's main goal is efficiency and survival, not happiness. If a certain mental pattern once helped you prepare for danger, avoid embarrassment, or stay alert to problems, the brain may continue using that pattern even when it's no longer useful. This is why some people automatically focus on mistakes rather than successes, or imagine worst-case scenarios even when nothing threatening is happening. The brain has simply become very skilled at running that particular program. Another important factor is repetition. Every time a negative thought appears and you engage with it by believing it, repeating it, or reacting emotionally, you strengthen the neural circuit behind it. It becomes easier and faster for the brain to activate that thought again in the future. Eventually, the thought appears so quickly that it feels like an immediate truth rather than a mental event. The person may not even notice the moment the thought began. It just feels like part of their identity. However, labeling these thoughts as personality traits can be misleading. Personality suggests something fixed or permanent, while neural patterns are dynamic. The brain constantly changes in response to experience, attention, and behavior. This property is known as neuroplasticity. It means that the same mechanisms that built the negative thought patterns can also weaken and replace them. When you understand that negative thinking is simply a trained pathway in the brain, it changes the way you respond to it. Instead of seeing the thought as a reflection of who you are, you can view it as a mental habit that the brain has practiced. Just as a habit can be formed through repetition, it can also be reshaped through new patterns of attention and behavior. This perspective removes a large amount of psychological weight. The thought, "I always think this way because it's who I am," becomes, "My brain learned this pattern because it practiced it many times." That shift in understanding opens the possibility for change because it separates your identity from the activity happening inside your mind. Most negative thought patterns operate automatically. They appear so quickly that people rarely notice the moment they begin. The brain is constantly predicting and interpreting situations based on past experiences, and these predictions often happen outside conscious awareness. When a familiar situation appears, such as receiving criticism, facing uncertainty, or making a mistake, the brain rapidly activates previously learned responses. These responses can include thoughts like, "I'm going to fail," "this will go wrong," or "I'm not capable." Because the brain has practiced these reactions many times, they occur almost instantly, creating the feeling that they are unavoidable. Awareness is what begins to break this automatic cycle. The moment you notice a negative thought as it appears, you create a small gap between the thought and your reaction to it. This gap is extremely important because it activates a different system in the brain. Instead of the brain running on autopilot through habitual circuits, the prefrontal cortex becomes engaged. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for observation, decision-making, and regulating emotional responses. When it becomes active, you gain the ability to evaluate the thought rather than immediately believing it. Labeling the thought is a simple but powerful way to activate this awareness. When a negative thought arises, mentally identifying it as a learned pattern or an automatic thought changes how the brain processes it. The act of labeling recruits networks involved in cognitive control. Research in neuroscience has shown that when people put words to their internal experiences, the emotional centers of the brain become less reactive. This means that the thought loses some of its intensity simply because it has been observed and named. Without awareness, the brain tends to follow the path of least resistance. A negative thought leads to a negative emotion, which leads to a reinforcing behavior such as avoidance, self-criticism, or withdrawal. Each time this chain completes itself, the neural pathway becomes stronger. But when awareness enters the process, that chain is interrupted. The thought still appears, but instead of automatically triggering the same emotional and behavioral reaction, it becomes something you can observe. This observation is not about suppressing or fighting the thought. Trying to push a thought away often backfires because it keeps your attention focused on the same mental content. Awareness works differently. It allows the thought to exist while reducing the sense that you must immediately respond to it. You become the observer of the mental event rather than the participant who is carried away by it. Over time, this repeated act of noticing and labeling changes how the brain treats those thoughts. When a pattern is consistently observed instead of automatically followed, the brain begins to recognize that the old response is no longer necessary. The neural circuits responsible for that automatic reaction gradually become less dominant because they are not being reinforced in the same way. The key point is that awareness shifts the brain from a reactive mode into a reflective mode. In reactive mode, thoughts control behavior. In reflective mode, thoughts become information that the brain can evaluate. This shift may seem subtle, but it fundamentally changes how the nervous system processes negative mental patterns. When a negative thought appears, the brain often reacts immediately with an emotional and physiological response. Heart rate may increase, muscles may tense, breathing may become shallow, and attention narrows toward the perceived problem. This reaction is driven largely by the brain's threat detection systems, particularly structures involved in emotional processing. From the brain's perspective, many negative thoughts are treated as signals of potential danger, even when the situation is not truly threatening. As a result, the body shifts into a more alert and defensive state. In this moment, reacting quickly can reinforce the pattern. If the brain instantly moves from the thought to a strong emotional reaction, the neural pathway connecting those events becomes stronger. The brain learns that whenever this type of thought appears, it should trigger the same response again. Over time, this creates a tightly connected loop between thought, emotion, and behavior. The loop can become so fast that the person barely notices the steps between them. Introducing a pause changes this process. Even a short pause of a few seconds creates an opportunity for the brain to shift from automatic reaction to conscious regulation. This pause works best when it is combined with controlled breathing. Breathing is one of the few bodily processes that is both automatic and voluntary, meaning you can intentionally change it to influence the state of your nervous system. Slow breathing, particularly through the nose, has a direct effect on the autonomic nervous system. When the inhale is steady and the exhale is slightly longer, signals are sent through neural pathways that promote parasympathetic activity. The parasympathetic nervous system is associated with calmness, recovery, and regulation. As this system becomes more active, the intensity of the stress response begins to decrease. This shift in physiology is important because emotional reactions are closely linked to bodily states. When breathing becomes slower and more controlled, heart rate tends to stabilize and muscle tension decreases. These physical changes send feedback signals to the brain, indicating that the situation may not be as threatening as initially predicted. As a result, the emotional charge connected to the thought begins to soften. With the emotional intensity reduced, the brain gains more flexibility in how it responds. Instead of being driven by urgency or fear, the mind can evaluate the thought more clearly. The prefrontal cortex becomes more engaged, allowing for reflection and decision-making. This means the person can choose how to respond rather than simply reacting out of habit. Another important aspect of the pause is that it disrupts the speed of the mental loop. Negative thought patterns often rely on momentum. One thought quickly leads to another, and soon the mind is cycling through multiple worries or self-critical ideas. Slowing the breath interrupts this cascade. The mind cannot easily maintain the same rapid chain of thoughts when the body is shifting into a calmer, physiological state. Practicing this pause repeatedly trains the nervous system to respond differently over time. The brain begins to associate the appearance of a negative thought with a moment of regulation instead of immediate escalation. Gradually, the gap between thought and reaction becomes more natural and easier to access. The individual learns that the first appearance of a thought does not require an instant emotional or behavioral response. creating more room for deliberate choice. Negative thought patterns often operate like sequences. A particular trigger appears, a familiar thought follows, an emotion rises, and then a predictable behavior completes the loop. For example, someone might make a small mistake at work. The trigger is the mistake. The automatic thought might be, "I'm not capable." That thought generates feelings of frustration or embarrassment. The final step might be avoiding the task, criticizing oneself repeatedly, or giving up on trying to improve. When this sequence happens again and again, the brain learns that this chain of events is the expected outcome whenever a similar trigger appears. The brain is strongly influenced by prediction. It constantly tries to anticipate what will happen next based on past patterns. When the same mental and behavioral sequence repeats over time, the brain begins to assume that the pattern will continue in the same way. This expectation is built into neural circuits that link thoughts, emotions, and behaviors together. Each time the sequence finishes exactly as predicted, the circuit becomes stronger and more efficient. Interrupting the pattern changes this process in a powerful way. When the usual reaction does not occur, the brain experiences what neuroscientists call a prediction error. A prediction error happens when the brain expects one outcome but observes a different one. This mismatch signals that the existing mental model may no longer be reliable. The brain then begins adjusting the strength of the neural connections involved in that pattern. For instance, imagine someone who normally responds to a negative thought with harsh self-criticism. The moment the thought appears, they usually repeat it in their mind and allow the emotional response to intensify. But if that person notices the thought and deliberately chooses not to continue the self-critical dialogue, the pattern stops halfway. The brain predicted that the thought would lead to a full cycle of emotional reinforcement, but that outcome never arrived. Over time, repeated interruptions like this weaken the connection between the initial thought and the habitual response. This process does not require eliminating the thought itself. Thoughts can still appear because the brain has practiced producing them. What matters is whether the sequence continues all the way to its usual conclusion. If the behavior at the end of the loop changes, the brain receives new information. Gradually, the link between the trigger and the old reaction becomes less automatic. The key factor is consistency. Interrupting the pattern once or twice may not have a strong effect because the brain still considers the old sequence to be reliable, but when the interruption happens repeatedly, the prediction error becomes more meaningful. The brain starts updating its expectations. It begins to recognize that the previous response is no longer guaranteed. Over time, this shift weakens the overall circuit that supported the negative pattern. The thought may appear less frequently, or it may arise with less emotional intensity. The brain gradually reduces its reliance on that pathway because it no longer produces the expected outcome. This mechanism shows that changing behavior at any point in the sequence can influence the entire pattern. By stopping the automatic reaction before it completes itself, the brain. When people try to break negative thought patterns, they often focus only on stopping the unwanted thought or behavior. While interruption is important, removing a pattern without replacing it can make the change unstable. The brain naturally seeks completion and structure. If an old pattern disappears but nothing takes its place, the nervous system tends to fall back into the familiar pathway simply because it already exists and requires less effort to activate. This is why replacement is a critical step in reshaping mental habits. The brain does not function well with empty gaps in behavioral sequences. When a negative thought is interrupted, the nervous system is briefly in a flexible state. During this moment, introducing a new action or constructive response helps guide the brain toward building a different neural pathway. Over time, this new pathway can become the default response. The replacement does not need to be complex or dramatic. In fact, simple and consistent actions often work best. When a negative thought appears, pairing it with a small constructive behavior sends a clear signal to the brain that a new response is being practiced. This could involve writing one small step toward a task, adjusting posture, taking a few steady breaths, or repeating a more balanced internal statement. The specific action matters less than the consistency of pairing the thought with a different outcome. Behavior plays a particularly strong role in shaping neural circuits. Thoughts alone can influence the brain, but physical actions produce broader changes across multiple systems. When you move your body, shift your environment, or engage in a task, sensory information flows back to the brain. This feedback reinforces the new pathway in a more concrete way. The nervous system begins associating the original trigger with a different set of signals and responses. For example, imagine someone who typically reacts to self-doubt by procrastinating. The moment the thought, "I can't do this," appears, the usual behavior is to avoid the task entirely. If that person interrupts the thought and immediately performs a small action related to the task, such as writing one sentence or reviewing one piece of information, the sequence changes. The brain predicted avoidance, but instead, it observed engagement. When this new pairing repeats many times, the connection between self-doubt and avoidance weakens, while a new association begins to form. Another reason replacement is important is that attention naturally seeks direction. When a thought is removed without guidance, the mind may wander back to the same negative theme. Providing a new focus through action, movement, or constructive thinking gives attention somewhere productive to go. This reduces the likelihood that the brain will re-enter the old loop. Over time, repeated replacement builds efficiency in the new circuit. The brain becomes quicker at activating the healthier response because it has practiced it many times. Eventually, the new pattern can become just as automatic as the old one once was. This process highlights an important principle of neuroplasticity. The brain strengthens the pathways that are used most often. By consistently pairing the interruption of a negative thought with a constructive action, the nervous system gradually reorganizes its preferred routes of response, receives a clear signal that the old loop is no longer the most reliable way to respond. One of the most important factors in changing thought and behavior patterns is repetition. The brain builds its wiring through repeated activity. Every time a specific thought occurs and is followed by the same emotional and behavioral response, the neural connections supporting that sequence become stronger. This strengthening happens because the brain is constantly adjusting itself to become more efficient at the patterns it uses most often. Over time, repeated experiences shape the structure and function of neural circuits so that certain responses become automatic. When a pattern has been repeated for years, it can feel deeply ingrained. A person might believe that their way of thinking is permanent simply because it appears so quickly and consistently. But what feels permanent is often just the result of thousands of previous repetitions. The brain has practiced that pathway so many times that it activates almost instantly. Changing such patterns requires introducing a different repetition, one that gradually competes with the old circuit. The process begins when a person notices the negative thought, interrupts the automatic reaction, and replaces it with a different response. At first, this new response may feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. The brain has not yet built a strong pathway for it, so it requires more conscious effort. During this early stage, the old pattern may still appear frequently because its neural connections are stronger and more efficient. However, every time the new response is repeated, the brain begins strengthening the alternative pathway. Neurons involved in the new behavior start firing together more consistently. As these neurons become more coordinated, the connection between them becomes more efficient. This is the same biological process that created the old pattern in the first place. The difference is that now the repetition is directed toward a healthier or more constructive response. Consistency matters more than intensity. Large, dramatic efforts are less effective than small actions repeated regularly. Even brief moments of interrupting a negative thought and choosing a different behavior contribute to reshaping the circuit. The brain tracks patterns across time. If it repeatedly observes that the old response is no longer being completed, while a new response appears instead, it gradually adjusts its expectations. Over weeks and months of repetition, the new pathway becomes easier to activate. What once required conscious attention begins to happen more naturally. The brain starts predicting the new response rather than the old one. At this stage, the negative thought may still appear occasionally, but it no longer leads automatically to the same emotional or behavioral outcome. This shift illustrates how adaptable the nervous system is. Neural circuits are not fixed structures. They are constantly being refined through experience. When a person consistently practices a new response to familiar triggers, the brain reorganizes itself to support that behavior more efficiently. Eventually, the new circuit becomes the preferred route. The brain activates it with less effort because it has been reinforced many times. The repetition that once maintained the negative pattern now serves to strengthen a healthier one. Demonstrating that the direction of move over time, this repeated process, creates a noticeable shift in how the mind responds to familiar situations. What once triggered immediate doubt, fear, or avoidance begins to produce a calmer and more balanced reaction. the brain gradually updates its internal predictions, favoring the pathways that have been practiced more consistently. As the new responses become easier and more automatic, the old patterns lose their influence because they are no longer being reinforced. This is how meaningful mental change happens, not through a single moment of motivation, but through steady repetition that slowly reshapes the brain's wiring until the healthier pattern becomes the natural way the mind operates. Mental change is largely determined by what the brain practices most often.